Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Dr. Andrew Reeves. Welcome, Andrew. Now, we often have people with different interests. I believe you're the first medieval scholar that's graced our show. But how did you get interested in medieval issues? I mean, how did that?
Oh, gosh. Short version of that is about 30 years ago, I read T.H. White's Once and Future King, and his vision of medieval Europe fascinated me.
Yes.
But also, as someone who's interested in both Christianity and also in political ideas about rights and freedoms, I can't help but be fascinated about how so much of what affects us today in the present has its roots in the thought of medieval Europe.
Well, I think that's a reasonable thing to conclude. Any comments about the relationship, which is we can segue into our present world, the relationship between the church and the state in Western medieval Europe? A few paragraphs on that. I mean, how did that work out? They were they were sometimes together, sometimes not.
I mean, the short version is the reason that in the Western tradition we even have the idea of church and state as separate.
Yes.
We don't have a hierophant, a god king,
yes,
a ruler of church and state is the same, is because during the Middle Ages, these conflicts between church and state, often vicious, lead to this notion of these two separate spheres.
Yes. How about the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne, 800 AD in Rome? What about that? I mean, it was the idea the church was the heir to the Roman Empire, and they were trying to, in some ways, co-opt their northern, powerful kings and make them on the same team and reduplicate the Roman Empire and its stability and good things under Christian auspices. Comments about that? Was that a rather brilliant thing, 800 AD, when that happened? Comments?
Well, with Charlemagne, you've got a couple things going on. In the first place, you've got the papacy needs a protector.
Yes.
Because theoretically, the Eastern Roman Empire is their protector, but the Exarch of Ravenna doesn't have enough soldiers to protect the Roman Pope.
Yes.
So they go to who? The most powerful kingdom that they can find, the Franks. This kingdom under Charlemagne that's conquered most of Western Europe. And then, though, the fascinating thing, Christmas Day, 800.
Yes.
St. Peter's Church. Old St. Peter's, not quite as opulent as modern St. Peter's.
Yes.
Emperor goes to church, because you go to church on Christmas.
Yes, a big day, yes.
And what does the Pope do? Emperor goes forward, or the king, he's still king at this point.
Yes.
Goes forward, he kneels. And then Pope pulls out a crown, pops it on his head, and a crowd, almost as if it's been coached, shouts, "Hail Charles the Great, Roman Emperor."
Yes.
And then there's a huge question here. Did the Pope plan that with Charlemagne, or did the Pope surprise him? Because what does it say? If the Pope gives the crown to the emperor, what does that say?
It would mean that as the emissary of God on earth, God had anointed Charlemagne as his powerful representative to act in a moral fashion and possibly kill the Saxons,
That's true.
slay Saxons.
It would also say that crown was the Pope's to give.
Yes.
And if it's the Pope's to give, it's also the Pope's to take away.
He would be the dominant. Well, that's right. And the relationship goes back and forth. And I think there was some problems with the Lombards.
Oh, yes.
Is that right? Yeah, I know you've neglected the Lombards.
Well,
Were
yes.
they causing Pope Leo some problems?
Well, the short version is that Pope Leo III runs the city of Rome. Because again, there's theoretically a prefect of the city.
Yes.
And he's fighting with the Lombards, and he goes and he asks Charlemagne for help.
Yes.
And, first, his predecessor is dealing with the Lombards. Then Pope Leo III is dealing with a Roman mob. The Roman popes are constantly trying to run the city.
Right.
So Charlemagne comes with the big old Frankish army, gets the Pope back in the city because a mob has chased him out, brutalizes the mob because that's what you do when you've got an army and you come into Rome, But it's after that, then, that Leo makes that gesture of crowning Charlemagne. And Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard, tells us that Leo had done this as a surprise. Einhard says that Charlemagne hadn't planned that ceremony.
Yes.
That Charlemagne was just going to go forward to the altar, kneel,
Right.
get a nice blessing, and be done.
Right.
And that Leo had whipped the crown out, popped it
Right.
on his head,
Right.
and thus tried to say that the crown belongs to the papacy to give or take away.
Approximately 1,000 years later, Napoleon did not make the same mistake. Is that correct?
Crowning himself.
He
Yep.
crowned himself. So he obviated the church. Well, I would never kill this, but the relationship between the state and the church is pretty complicated, and the absolute monarchs of the as time went along, that whole idea depended on that relationship. And in a way, if you were a peasant, it would be very difficult to stand up against that. If the church and the king were in cahoots, shall we say, with each other, it would be hard for you to interject your personal selfish opinions into this situation.
Right. So when you talk about the peasant, you have stumbled into a trap, because medieval peasants and their religion is actually what I've written way too much about. And
Well, let's hope it's not quicksand.
Yeah.
But, so you know a lot about peasants.
yes.
How about and feudalism, as I assume,
Right.
the two in Western Europe. So they had the great barbaric, migrations, and out of that, there must have been a way that people were sort of gradually put under the thumb of
Correct.
the local lords, and the idea of how property was passed along. Is comments on that? And
Okay,
how-
so
yeah.
what we call feudalism was basically a settlement that emerged out of about a century and a half of chaos and mayhem.
Yes.
Now, later on, lawyers for the French crown tried to draw up a system of feudalism that was this very neat, ordered pyramid. But that's not really what it was. What we think of as feudalism emerged out of this settlement that happened just gradually over the course of about a century and a half from over the course of the 900s. It's essentially armed strongmen extracting the surplus of peasant farmers in control of different parts of Western Europe, and the church trying to give some sense of order, legitimacy, trying to make this more than just armed thuggery. And so that's basically what feudalism is. It's a compromise. It's a compromise between these armed thugs who control facts on the ground and a monarchy that is honestly fairly weak, together with a church that is trying to impose some sort of discipline on this whole order to make it not just essentially law of the jungle. Does that make sense?
Well, in the broad brush world, I think it does, but I'll bounce the ball a little more on that. What about the disruptions of the feudal system, particularly with the Vikings and these petty kings that were fighting one another, particularly in England?
Right.
There must have the sense of destruction of the social order must have been always present, and that should have had some kind of impact, did it not? The struggle for stability.
Oh, it absolutely did.
Everyone wanted stability. Any kind of law would be better than chaos.
Right, and that was how you had that system emerge. You have chaos and mayhem in the 10th century. Again, you've got to imagine, we think knight oftentimes in terms of late medieval Arthurian guys in plate armor. And knight in the sense of the late 900s, early 1000s is much more armed thug. Think Mad Max. Think armed warlord. And so out of that, though, stability does arise because fundamentally you do have societies kind of converge on an equilibrium. And that's what happened in Western Europe. You get all these kind of small-scale warlords
Yes.
with the peasants they're in charge of. You have a church that legitimates it, and a church that does its best to try to control these guys. Make sure they're not murdering civilians. Make sure that their private warfare does not involve too much plunder of the church. Basically, it's a civilizing process that the church is trying to impose on this knightly class. And the surprising thing is, it mostly works. It's ragged and ugly, but by especially the 12th century, you have a system where there is a church providing legitimacy, a monarchy with its legitimacy provided by the church, and a knightly class that mostly buys this system, and a peasant class that honestly is something of an afterthought. If you read any of the theorists, they're not really thinking of peasants except as a source of income. But there is gradually going to emerge a sense that state, armed forces, knightly class should protect the peasants. Is this largely an ideal? Yes. But it's going to gradually emerge out of that. And if we have time, I really want to talk about how this works, especially in the Anglo-American system, and how that comes about with an actual idea of individual rights and freedoms reaching down to the peasant. But that might be a bit much.
Well, let's swing the tiller of our little ship here into the question of contracts, contract law and social contracts, and rights and privileges, and what the arrangements were. So presumably, there was some kind of contractual arrangement that existed in a feudal state. The deal was not a particularly good one, if one could say, or was it for the peasant? And then gradually, in some ways, the contractual arrangements changed as the divine right of kings was diminished. If you're in this contractual arrangement to start with in feudal times, one could well say that God was sanctioning whatever the church was doing, and the church was sanctioning the state in a complicated way, and the support of the whole arrangement were the peasants, the people that lived in the agricultural world. They had a very narrow, brutish life. Is that a fair statement or not? And then isn't this what happened as time went along, and particularly the cities arose, they're outriders in this system. So can you comment about the bourgeoisie?
So
I'm throwing you some broad.
Oh yeah, this is a fairly broad question. So.
And social contract.
Contract law, ownership. Caveat.
Yes.
I have taken a mighty 2 semesters of law in graduate school. Well, one in graduate school, one in undergrad. I have looked at my notes, and I know I took them because they are in my own hand.
Yes.
But my memory of them is fuzzy. So, that aside, the thing about contract, and especially things like obligation ownership, it's really in the 13 and 1400s that you're going to slowly start to move from in the English-speaking tradition, obviously.
Right, yes.
You're going to see a movement from the idea of land tenure that's fundamentally feudal. You hold land of someone in exchange for service. And over the 13 and 1400s, you do start to see the emergence of the idea of actual ownership, that you can alienate land through contract, that you can buy and sell land. But that's fairly late. That's a little bit posterior to later ideas of rights that are developing, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries. And I'm going to take this as an opportunity to bring up, of course, we think of Magna Carta, right? The foundation of our freedoms. And the thing is, it kind of is. It wasn't meant to be that. It was meant to just be a temporary treaty ending a minor civil war. Dust up between a king and his nobles.
Yes.
And as a settlement, it's like the Don having a sit down with all his boys. Yes. But as a consequence of that, what do you have? You have a few basic ideas that are baked into this. It didn't make it into the final draft of Magna Carta, but it did, in fact, it made it into the first draft of Magna Carta, but it didn't make it into the ratified draft, is the idea that taxation can only be levied with consent of the community of the realm. And of course, if we've done U.S. history, we're like, wait a minute, taxation can only come about with the consent of the community of the realm. That should kind of cause some alarm bells to ring. And there's also the provision that a free man cannot be deprived of life and property unless he's been tried by a jury of his peers. So those are those foundational elements. Then, though, that's interesting enough. But of course, when these barons, these nobles, are talking about a free man, they're not thinking of peasants. They're thinking of knightly class. But
the barons, yes.
But something happens over the 13th century. The lawyers who've drawn up these very precise definitions of a free man make a distinction between the free peasant and the unfree peasant, the serf and the free peasant. And then by accident, they've created this idea of basic rights for the free Englishman. They didn't plan on that. These are just lawyers trying to say what is a free man. You know, the same way that whenever you draw a statute, you know, the first part of the statute is here's the definitions. But it creates this idea of, wait a minute, free person does include free peasants. And then, in the mid-1200s, you get a civil war that breaks out.
Many civil wars.
Many civil wars. This one is particularly important, though, because it's a civil war between Baron Simon de Montfort and a lot of barons following him and the English crown. Why they start fighting is unimportant. But what's important is once this rebellion breaks out, it starts out as these disaffected barons. But then, what does it become? It becomes this movement, the first ever political movement in Anglophone history, the first ever mass political movement. And what is it about? It's about basic rights of free Englishmen in the community of the realm. And it gets even more interesting. So, 1258, this Council of Barons briefly takes control of the realm of England. And then they start investigating abuses of power by royal officials. But it goes further than that. They start investigating abuses of power by barons against peasants. And more importantly, this anti-royal movement starts getting a lot of peasants joining it, and eventually even unfree peasants. Now, the movement gets crushed. In the early 1260s, Simon de Montfort loses. He is defeated at the Battle of Evesham, and he is in fact hacked to pieces by the Lord Edward and his cronies. And you'd think that's the end of that. But it's not, because it's out of this rebellion that you really see the idea of using parliaments to solidify consent of the community of the realm take place. And even those peasants who've taken part in the rebellion, obviously they get disseized of their chattels and property, but the punishment is not as harsh as you'd think it is. You know, there are heavy fines and such, but this is kind of this foundational element of every free person can defend their rights against the crown. And that is bubbling below the surface. Because again, we go to later disruptions with, for example, you know, Richard II, or then even later the English Civil War in the early 17th century. But that is this kind of foundational thing in English law, this idea that the free person does have rights against the crown. Okay, I've talked about this a lot, but this is one of these things that
obviously it's an issue of consequence in your life, which is good. I think that's good. Well, I mean, understanding how rights had their origin, and the relationship between the states, the church, and some kind of a moral authority, how control is exercised. I mean, that seems to be an issue there, and the necessity for control is another one that appears. I'll ask this question. The situation you talked about in medieval times, when the barbaric tribes were sweeping over and destroying the Roman Empire, it's sort of the sense of community might have been higher. Is that right? I mean, the the sense of obligations to the militia, I guess we call it the folk, whatever it's called here, that existed in England in any event. The idea that you, for instance, the Battle of Hastings, Harold picked up all the militia to go fight. Right. And so there were some obligations like that, and this a sense of some kind of law, English common law. Was the thought was this present, say in the 500 AD, and was it transmuted somehow by the events of 600 years, 700 years? And then finally reemerged as it bloomed again in the 13th century.
Oh gosh, this is Ernst Breisach has referred to this as the Germanist thesis.
Yes.
Because
well, I'm glad I could hook up with him.
There's a long bubbling dispute among scholars of the Middle Ages going back a century and a half as to whether you can trace the idea of individual rights all the way back to these Germanic peoples who took over in the post-Roman environment. And I think there's some there. There is some there, because, you look at Iceland. You look at Iceland, and what do you see? You see, this Viking republic, with a legislative assembly, with a thing, already by the 900s.
Right, for 1,000-year history.
Yes, although
it had its ups and downs.
Yes, although again, I have some issues with the way that right libertarians will often talk about Iceland, but there is this notion. I think there is an idea of the sort of assembly of free men. That, I think there's a case to be made for that as a foundation of a lot of Anglo-American rights. And this might get me in a whole lot of trouble. I'm glad we have a small audience, but...
Well, not necessarily. No, we assume it's a little de minimis, but we never know.
But there is a really strong case to be made that when you have this community that forms with ideas of universal military service and the idea of universal freemen's military service, that's this foundational nugget that is, I think at any rate, at the bottom of a lot of what we in the common law tradition think of as the foundations of our rights and freedoms. Now, when I talk about common law rights and freedoms, a whole lot of Irish, Africans, and South Asian peoples might stop and say, excuse me, what rights and freedoms?
Yes.
But that's, I think, the story of the last 5 centuries from our time, is taking this idea of rights and freedoms that are based in individual peoples, for example, the English people, and then universalizing that. That's, I think, the great story of the last 5 centuries, is people saying, there are rights and freedoms, but they're for everyone. And again, when I talk about the last 5 centuries, I'm talking as a generalist. Yes. My specialty is medieval Europe. When I talk about, small L liberalism and liberal democracy, yes, I'm speaking more as an interested generalist.
Well, actually, it's interesting that you spring from that direction with medieval times. The problems they faced then, maybe there's some relationship we have. It does appear that we continue to see the same history repeating itself cyclically on and on and on, and the disputes, war, empires brought down, struggles to make things work, and it can one say that putting a very rigid system in place would ideally, I think people think of feudalism or a stable arrangement that was put there. You were born into a certain class, to certain obligations, and then you would go to your reward in the next life. At least that was the hypothetical ideal in some circles, or at least maybe just from the point of view of fable, possibly. But the disruptions were everywhere in that ideal. For instance, even the church had schisms going back and forth, anti-popes, all kinds of things were happening. Economic circumstances were not stable. Plagues came along, famines came along, Vikings came along. All kinds of disruptive events took place. And how that system coped with that. Cities, what I'm sort of driving at is that the desire to have stability is often a fool's errand. And the trick is how you develop, how you handle change in the most appropriate way. And looking at the medieval times, can you name circumstances where these changes were handled the most appropriate way? I mean, these things happen, but who did a good job? For instance, did the Burgundians do a good job? Did the Dutch do a good job? Or Irish kings, whatever. I mean, who are the Icelandic people?
Well,
who handled the change the best with the least problems?
I would say that the political and religious system that handled changes the best was the Holy Roman Empire. This Central European, I don't even want to call it a state, more this kind of collection.
They had the 7 electors or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, the thing about the Holy Roman Empire is, like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, in 800, Charlemagne gets crowned emperor. Then it falls apart. Then in the 900s, you rebuild this kind of combination of Central Europe and Italy. But these emperors fight to try to centralize control, to rule all of Central Europe and Italy. And they fail. And we might say that they failed. They didn't create a unified top-down state like England or France. But Holy Roman Empire lasted from 800 to 1800.
Was it 1796? No.
Right, about that. It lasted 1,000 years.
Napoleon knocked it off.
Yes, but it lasted precisely because after the emperors failed, what did they do? By the 1300s, they rebuilt a system of loose consensus and cooperation, of courts that often dragged appeals out for decades. But what did that do? That created a system that forced people to come to consensus, to develop a sense of stability, to develop a workable system that in many ways might be a model for systems like today the EU or other sort of multinational organizations. So fundamentally, the failure of the centralizers resulted in a system that rewarded consensus.
Okay, well, on that note, Dr. Reeves, it's been great having you here.
Thank you. It's been good being here.
You're a real, fundle of important information that I hope our audience can partake. And it's been great having you here, and we wish to see you some more. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.